While Nintendo 64 may have been somewhat revolutionary at the time for bringing amazing games such as Mario 64 to the table, in 2021 most of us now tend to look at the platform through a very different lens. A console heavily featuring games with primitive polygon graphics that never had that many games even released for it in the first place. Compared to most popular consoles, the Nintendo 64's library is extremely small, but that did not stop developers holding many games back and releasing them exclusively in Japan. So while some may be finding enjoyment from the device today by hacking the likes of Bloody Bowsette into the game, you yourself could breathe new life into your rotting platform by trying out many of the titles that were not released overseas. So ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here, and this is 25 great Japanese exclusives for the Nintendo 64 that you couldn't play. Yeah! We shall start today's list off with Bakuretsu Muteki Bangai O, a multi-directional shooter developed by Treasure and released in 1999. The game received a worldwide release on the Sega Dreamcast, but if you want to play it on the Nintendo 64, you need a Japanese copy. As with any game from Treasure, the game is very unique and experimental. The player controls a weaponised mech in efforts to stop criminals from smuggling fruit contraband. There are 44 stages to play through, populated with enemies, destroyable buildings and obstacles, as well as some walls that are opened by switches. The game is unique in that a Treasure programmer wanted to challenge himself by programming an extreme number of bullets onto the screen at once, which is why the team opted for simple graphical effects to preserve the game's speed. The game was niche even by Japanese standards, with a limited run produced of just 10,000 copies. For this reason I snapped up a complete in-box copy a few years ago, as it is only a matter of time before the value of this one goes through the roof. It may come as a surprise to you, but Pocket Monster Stadium was never released in the West, as by the time the Pokemon franchise was widely celebrated elsewhere, Pocket Monster Stadium 2 had been released, so they just promoted the second game in Japan as the first in the West. This 1998 game is more simplified than what we would get, including allowing gamers to only play as 40 Pokemon. The game also only featured 2 tournaments to play in, as opposed to 4 like in the sequel. The game was also a lot tougher in some ways, as the game never allowed for continues, so if you lost a battle it was game over. While there are 111 Pokemon that cannot be used in battle, their 3D models can still be viewed in the other modes. Interestingly, Pocket Monster Stadium 2 was never originally supposed to be released, but instead this original game was set to offer a full stadium experience via the usage of an expansion disc for the 64DD. But considering what a flop the disc drive was, Nintendo instead had to release a game with all of the additional content as a standalone title. Still though, I think this is an interesting part of gaming history that is rarely touched upon. If there is one thing most people around the world know about the Japanese, is that they bloody love giant fighting robots, mechs and strange sexual fetishes. But the last part of that sentence is irrelevant to our video today. Last Legion UX is a third-person 3D action combat mech game. The Hudson published game, developed by Yuke's, lets players choose from 6 mechs in either story mode or multiplayer in arena-style fighting gameplay, on battlefields that are free-for-all mazes of tunnels and towers, as well as open fields. The game offers strong multiplayer appeal, making it a perfect game for the Nintendo 64's party-style system. While the game is fairly text heavy, thankfully English fan translations are available for this game too, adding a further layer of enjoyment. Animal Crossing is one of Nintendo's biggest IPs today, but what most people do not know is that in Japan the brand's history stretches all the way back to the Nintendo 64, with the release of a game known as Animal Forest. This 2001 title was one of the later games released on the system, but it was still the first game in a series that would eventually spawn a marketing empire. It would be right here that beloved characters such as the mortgage-approving Tom Nook would make his debut, and trivial relaxing pursuits such as fishing and catching insects would be established in this world. The historical importance of this game is impossible to discount. In the wacky world of Japanese gaming, the nation would receive Densha de Go 64, a 1999 train simulator by Taito that allowed train enthusiasts, train spotters, to drive iconic Japanese trains across well-known railways. What makes this title even more insane is that it had its own amazing peripheral that replicated the controls of Taito's previous train-related arcade hit. The controls that emulated a train dashboard featured pressure gauges for both throttle and braking. In this game, players keep trains running on time while ensuring they remain under the speed limit, along with sound of the horn before bridges and crossings. Whoever said the Nintendo 64 was just about 3D platformers is of course very wrong. Many of us found enjoyment playing Bomberman 64 here in the West, but did you know that in Japan, Bomberman 64 is a completely different game? The adventure game we know and love was released as Baku Bombermanu over there, but they too would get a title simply known as Bombermanu 64 in the year 2001. This game, on the other hand, functions just like Bomberman of old, and replicates the same sort of Bomberman play that could be found on the Super Nintendo. So basically, classic 2D fun, which, as you know, console marketeers were trying to stray as far away from as possible in the West at the time. So it is not surprising whatsoever that this game got left in Japan. Here in the Anglosphere, we often celebrate the likes of WWF No Mercy and WrestleMania 2000 as some of the greatest wrestling games ever. Prior to those games seeing release, the same creators known as Asmic Ace Entertainment and the Aki Corporation gave Japan Virtual Pro Wrestling 64. The game is the 1996 Japan-only counterpart to WCW vs NWO World Tour, but instead of featuring a WCW lineup, in this one gamers can play as wrestlers from NJPW and All Japan Pro Wrestling. The game, that utilises arguably some of the greatest wrestling mechanics ever conceived, includes post-match scoring systems as well as the ability to edit wrestlers' attires, features that would not be included in its WCW counterpart at the time. So this is the more refined effort. Puyo Puyo and Party is the fourth instalment in the Puyo Puyo puzzle game series. The gameplay in this is similar to that of Puyo Puyo 2, but adds some super attacks. Clearing chains now builds up a charge meter which allows players to use them. By now, Puyo Puyo is a massively popular series, so I don't really feel I need to go into any further detail regarding this popular puzzle game's mechanics. But this entry took full advantage of the Nintendo 64's 4 controllers by offering 4-player Puyo Puyo fun, making this the perfect game to whip out at a party, if parties were still actually legal. Wonder Project J2 is a quirky life simulation video game published by Enix for the platform. The game is the sequel to the 1994 Super Famicom game, which we spotlit in my Super Famicom Games You Couldn't Play video. In this one, players communicate with Josette through her robot bird, with players answering her simple yes or no answer questions. Player advancement through the game is dependent on how well their teachings mesh with other activities on the island. Despite this game never making it out of Japan, English speakers can now try this bizarreness through taking advantage of a fan translation from 2007. Yay! If you owned a Super Nintendo, you are almost guaranteed to remember Mario Paint. In Japan, the game got a sort of sequel with the release of Mario no Photopea, a 1998 creative title that let gamers retouch photos and change their image compositions. So I suppose there's some crossover with the Game Boy camera as well. Gameplay consists of puzzles that the system constructs from images, encouraging user-generated content. The player can compose a unique image using the included Mario series clip art, borders, fonts and other graphics. Due to having 2 card slots on the top of the game cartridge, images can be imported from a personal computer or camera and retouched in the game's compositions. Completed compositions can be exported to a personal computer, or even printed in Fuji printing kiosks in Japanese shopping malls. It is sad really that the Nintendo 64 got so much support in Japan compared to elsewhere, particularly when you take into account that the Saturn sold better over there. SD Hiryuu no Ken Densetsu is basically an updated version of Hiryuu no Ken Twin, a hidden gem of a fighting game on the Nintendo 64 known as Flying Dragon in the West. The game features the highly popular in Japan super deformed art style, with the word deformed in that part of the world clearly not carrying the same connotations that it does here. This game is basically a Street Fighter style upgrade, giving Japanese players more characters, items and gameplay modes. Basically, this is the definitive version of Flying Dragon for the platform. Custom Robo V2 is a sci-fi action role-playing game that was developed by Noise and released in the year 2000. This is one of 2 great custom robo games that the system received in Japan. The games feature shared elements involving collecting, customizing and taking part in battles with frantic action in 3D arenas like in Virtual On for the Sega Saturn. The second entry builds on the first by including tag team matches players, with combatants having the objective to reduce their opponent's hit points using different custom robos, guns, bombs, pods and dash attacks. This is more Japanese robotic fun. Puyo Puyo and Party was not the only big puzzle game franchise that received Japan-only installments. The system also got Tetris 64. While the game is basically, well, just Tetris, so does not really push the platform to illustrate what it was capable of, the game is notable for coming packed in with one of the most ridiculous peripherals in Nintendo history. Even stranger than the train simulator one we mentioned earlier, the game was compatible with the Nintendo 64 biosensor, an accessory produced by Sita. The biosensor looks like a Nintendo 64 controller pack with a wire coming out of it with a clip on the end. One end of the sensor plugs into the extension port on the Nintendo 64 controller and the other end clips onto the player's ear. The device is then used to measure the user's heart rate so that you can physically see how the tension and action included in Tetris affects your body. Only in Japan, eh? Speaking of bizarreness, I thought I had to mention Super Mario 64 Shindo Pacteo version, an enhanced version of Mario 64 that was only ever released in Japan. Basically, Mario 64 would see a second release in the country, which would include Charles Martinet's English voice portrayal for Mario, and all of the new English text for the game would be translated back into Japanese. The biggest change to the game though is that it would be made compatible with the newly released Rumble Pack, so if Mario made contact with an enemy or performed a ground pound, false feedback would be given. These are cool features, but it's pretty insane that they would re-release the game just to include these minor tweaks. I can't argue though that this game's existence is certainly a very cool piece of trivia. J-League 11 Beat 1997 is a football game released by Hudson Soft, a genre that is both adored and beloved throughout most sane parts of the world. The J-League in Japan is the equivalent to our Premier League, where the top flight of Japanese football is played. The game is unique on the platform for the, in my opinion, wonderful art style that the game depicts, leading to it aging better than most sports games on the platform. I loved Nintendo World Cup on the Game Boy for this exact same reason, but sadly I would assume these cartoon graphics are probably the same reason Hudson felt that the game would probably not have much appeal overseas, which is a shame as I 100% would have purchased this game. Shiren the Wander 2 is a role-playing game developed in the year 2000 by Chunsoft. The game is actually part of the Mystery Dungeon series, which has become popular in the West since the crossovers with the Pokemon brand. The aim is to build a castle, but to do so players must find stone, iron, water, earth and wood to use as building materials. These materials are procured by exploring dungeons, but each time the player enters a dungeon, its layout and the locations of the items and monsters within it change. The player battles through these dungeons using katanas, broadswords, sickles and other weapons. The game is like the coronavirus. Novel. One of my all-time favourite series is Goemon, with many of the franchise's classics being left in Japan. The Nintendo 64 would have its own exclusive Goemon game too, known as Goemon Monoke Sugoroku. The 1999 game has similarities with the Mario Party series, as this entry is based on the Japanese board game Sugoroku, making the game very Japanese indeed. As expected, the game is populated by an array of Konami's Goemon characters, and can be played up to 4 players using the 64's 4 controller ports. I cannot say I expect this game to be officially localised anytime soon. Susumi Tyson Puzzle Dharma is another 2D matching based puzzle game on this list. In this one, balls descend down the screen in different colours, but can come in 2 different sizes. The smaller balls come in locked square boxes, but when a large ball is cleared when matched near a small ball, the boxes are unlocked, becoming big balls, allowing for combos. The game, that features playing with all kinds of balls, large and small, features anime-style women in the background for extra visual appeal. Everything about this one was made for the Japanese market, and I guess people who love balls. Nushi Tsuri 64, released in 1998, is basically a fishing role-playing game, combining gameplay elements together you would not necessarily expect. In this game you can freely explore and visit multiple different towns, where if you choose to, you can purchase various fishing related equipment. Speaking of further role-playing elements, random encounters can occur while walking around, against other wildlife that can attack you, such as warthogs. You can chase these animals away using rocks and other weapons, so that you can continue your quest to achieve fishing greatness. Being an avid fishing lover as a kid, and a fan of Pokemon, I would have adored this game as a child. Virtual Pro Wrestling 2 Odu Kaisho is the Nintendo 64's second Virtual Pro Wrestling game. This one is the Japanese brother entry to WrestleMania 2000, but the two titles differ considerably, including the game's rosters themselves. What may come as a surprise is that WrestleMania 2000 was released in Japan as well, so the two games needed to be different besides just wrestlers. This would see the game de-emphasising the gimmicks and theatrics of American wrestling, while introducing various competitive, sportsman-like attributes of Puro, including an entirely unique grappling system developed for mixed martial artists, which corresponds with optional shoot fighting rules. We could talk about this game and what it brought to the table all day, but I am confident I am going to give you a standalone video on this one down the line, so you can look forward to that one. Goemon 3D, released in 1998, is an innovative game released by Athena. The game is a space shooter similar to Vanishing Earth, which is also available on the Nintendo 64. But this one differs as it includes an impressive Mario Maker-like game editor mode, which allows players to design their own shooter levels. This creative title brings an array of different options to the table, even allowing players to make stage bosses or even add custom soundtracks. What is sad about this one is the game should have been even bigger and better, as it was set to have its own expansion disc, which could have been taken advantage of using the 64DD. Such a shame, but at least the cartridge version of the game exists. Super Robot Wars 64 is a rare strategy role-playing game amongst the Nintendo 64's library, featuring the same grid-based fun as the likes of Advance Wars and Fire Emblem, two franchises that are shockingly omitted from the Nintendo 64's library. The game, that features super deformed Gundams and other classic anime characters, is notorious for its ridiculous amount of stages and rather complex branching system. The game is a breath of fresh air on the platform. Yuchanan-chan no Hono no Challenger Denru Iri Bo. Something I'm definitely not pronouncing right. It's just exactly the sort of strange quirkiness you would expect from a list of games that have been restricted to just Japan. The whole game is based on just one segment of a Japanese game show, which was also highlighted in the Neo Geo game known as Irritating Maze. So in this game, players guide the tip of an electrode rod through a course as fast as they can while avoiding the metallic frame, similar to a traditional wire loop game. You can even compete against each other in multiplayer, trying to guide your rods the fastest. The whole game is accompanied by hilarious Japanese commentary, which you do not even have to understand to get a laugh out of. It all feels a bit Takeshi's Castle, and I love it. Shin Nihon Pro Wrestling Tuken Road 2 is the final entry in a series of Shin Nihon Wrestling games available on the Nintendo 64. The game was developed by Yuke's, the very same developers who would give us the critically acclaimed SmackDown series on the Sony PlayStation. What some may not know though is that while THQ published their WWF SmackDown games on Sony's hardware, Hudson published their Japanese games on the Nintendo 64. So if you want something different from the vast amount of great games made by Aki Asmik, then try this one out. Last but not least on the list we have Sin and Punishment, a game that is so good that most people are already aware of it, despite the fact it was locked to just one region for so long. This is a rail shooter that was co-developed by the absolutely legendary pairing of Nintendo and Treasure, presenting an absolutely insane collaborative effort. The unique control scheme allows the player to strafe, jump and dodge around the screen while simultaneously aiming the targeting reticle. Like in any rail shooter, players need to shoot at enemies and projectiles while dodging attacks to survive and progress through the game. The game was developed painstakingly over 4 years by just 4 members of staff, but the unconventional effort that was built around a game that fully utilised the Nintendo 64's controller paid off in terms of quality. The game would develop such a cult following in the West that Nintendo would release the game to everyone on the Wii Virtual Console years later, but bearing in mind the service has now ended, the only way to play an official copy of the game is once again importing it from Japan. So, ladies and gentlemen, that was 25 Nintendo 64 games that Nintendo region locked to Japan. It is interesting to consider if these 25 quality games had have been released in the West, would the system still have a reputation of having hardly any games and being little more than a system for those who love 3D platformers and kart racers? It is an interesting question to consider, as while most of these games would have ended up cult classics in the West at best, it certainly would have brought a lot more diversity to the platform, especially considering that not even half of these games discussed today rely solely on 3D polygons. So it is clear that Japanese Nintendo gamers were given a lot more variety than what us Westerners appear to have been force-fed with the over-reliance on polygon gaming. Either way, the magic of emulation and fan translations means the whole world can finally experience these games whether Nintendo choose to selfishly region lock their content or not. This means Nintendo no longer have the power to stop us from having fun, and we can actually experience these gems even if we were prevented from before. So I guess next time you hear someone say that the Nintendo 64 didn't have hardly any games, change their perspective by bringing up these 25 beauties. Yeah! If you enjoyed this video, I have also made videos covering 50 Sega Saturn Japanese exclusives, 60 Genesis Mega Drive ones, and 100 Super Famicom Japan only entries. I will attach all of these videos to the end card and to the pinned comment below, so be sure to check those out if you have not already. These videos are produced in part due to fan support from Patreon that allows me to work on YouTube full time. In my search for more backers to continue to secure the future of this channel, I now release one extra exclusive video a week over there, with a video covering the obscure side Biko airing some point next week. Have a look over there if you want to join that segment of my community. Speaking of Patreon, special thank yous go out to Sebastian, VELEZ, Carl Johnson, A Murder of Crows, Heyo Paulo Lopez, Joseph Razmik, Ben Harradine, Corey Armarsh Sr., Capcom vs SNK, BXL Gotham, Rowan Dinched, Evan Border, Philip Manth, Cambo Rambo 82, Azrael Rarakai, Keith Ferguson, Dropkin Varela, Prince Knight, Michael Cullix, Ego, Jordan Durant, Angel Light 85, Alethea Swanson, Nick Daniels, Princess Zana, Glennie Glenn, Daniel Daly, Computer Man, House of a Ted, Gary Pinkett, ECU Professor, Kid Anime, Justin Wang, Aaron McNamara, Hermes Gonzalez, Instant Gratification Monkey, Man Shovel, James Bishop, JB, Michael Hall, Wesley Sang-Yi, Ben Dover, Langston Miller, New Brian Barry, Sarah Powell, They Mink Renee, Marvin Araliga, Chris Cord, TOG Driver, Adrian Hannington, Bernard NG, Richard Stew, Stewart, James McDonald, Dan Van Dammit, Lewis Fiance, John Bates, David Ball, Chris Fisk, Mike Bruno, Rick67, Antonio Rodriguez, Craig Jenkins, Retroverse.com, Casey Wright, Sin Spaces, Zai, Andrew Bazansky, Gunther Hendricks, and everybody else who continues to support this channel. I love you all very much. Thank you. Cheerio!